Consider, if you will, the nature of consequences. A single decision, made in anger or in haste, can echo across decades. It can shape the destinies of millions who have not yet been born. In the summer of 1918, as the guns fell silent across the fields of Europe, the victors gathered to forge a peace. They believed they were ending war itself. Instead, they planted the seeds of a greater catastrophe. The Palace of Versailles, with its hall of mirrors reflecting infinite images, became the stage for retribution dressed as justice. Germany, exhausted and defeated, was made to sign a treaty that would define humiliation for a generation. The architects of this peace were not blind to mercy. They simply believed that crushing defeat was the only language empires understood. Strip away the colonies, dismantle the military, exact reparations so severe that Germany would spend decades repaying the cost of its aggression. On paper, it seemed logical. A nation broken could not wage war. But consider what they failed to see. In every German city, soldiers returned home not to celebration but to chaos. The economy, already strained by 4 years of total war, now faced impossible demands. Inflation spiraled into madness. A wheelbarrow of currency could not buy a loaf of bread. Savings evaporated. The middle class, that stable foundation of any society, found themselves reduced to poverty overnight. And in that desperation, in that collective sense of betrayal, something dangerous took root. Resentment is a peculiar force in human affairs. It simmers, it waits, it searches for a voice to give it form and purpose. In the beer halls of Munich, a voice emerged. Adolf Hitler was not born to power. He was not descended from kings or generals. He was a failed artist, a corporal from the trenches, a man who understood the art of grievance. He looked at Germany's humiliation and offered something intoxicating. The promise that none of this had to be accepted. The war had not been lost on the battlefield, he declared. It had been betrayed from within. The Treaty of Versailles was not justice, it was theft. This narrative, false though it was, found fertile ground. When people are desperate, when their children go hungry and their dignity feels stripped away, they become susceptible to simple explanations for complex problems. Hitler provided enemies to blame: communists, Jews, the weak politicians who had signed away Germany's honor, and he provided a vision: Germany restored, Germany respected, Germany reclaiming its rightful place among nations. Watch how methodically he moved. In 1933, after years of political maneuvering, he became chancellor through democratic process. Within months, democracy itself was dismantled. Opposition parties dissolved, the Reichstag burned, and emergency powers became permanent. But to the world beyond Germany's borders, these seemed like internal matters. Britain and France, still recovering from their own wounds, had little appetite for intervention. Then came the calculated gambles, each one testing the resolve of former enemies. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, that demilitarized buffer zone established by Versailles. It was a direct violation of the treaty, and Hitler's generals were terrified. They knew Germany was not yet ready for war. If France had mobilized, if Britain had protested with force rather than words, the German army had orders to retreat immediately. But France and Britain did nothing. They watched. They protested diplomatically. They let it pass. Hitler learned a crucial lesson that day. The victors of the Great War no longer had the will to enforce their peace. Each successful gamble emboldened the next. In 1938, he turned his attention to Austria, his homeland. The Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria, was presented as the natural reunification of Germanic peoples. Austrian Nazis staged demonstrations. German troops rolled across the border, not to conquer, but to welcome. And once again, Europe watched but did not act. Then came Czechoslovakia, and here the pattern grew more brazen. The Sudetenland, a region along the Czech border populated largely by ethnic Germans, became Hitler's next target. But Czechoslovakia was different. It had alliances. It had a defensive treaty with France. It had fortifications along its borders that made invasion costly. Surely, now, the line would be held. In September of 1938, the leaders of Europe gathered in Munich. Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and Daladier. Conspicuously absent were any representatives of Czechoslovakia itself, the nation whose fate was being decided. The agreement reached that day would become synonymous with the failure of appeasement. Germany would have the Sudetenland. In exchange, Hitler promised this was his last territorial demand. He wanted only to unite all German peoples under one flag. Chamberlain returned to London, waving a paper, declaring he had secured peace for our time. Consider the perspective of those who defended this decision. The Great War had killed tens of millions. Entire villages in France and Britain had lost their young men. The thought of another such conflict was unbearable. If territorial concessions could prevent that horror, if giving Hitler what he claimed to want would satisfy his ambitions, was that not a price worth paying? They chose to believe in the possibility of peace because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. But 6 months later, in March of 1939, German tanks rolled into the rest of Czechoslovakia, seizing Prague and dismembering the nation completely. The promise made at Munich was revealed as worthless. The game was clear now to anyone willing to see it. Hitler would take what he could, promise peace, then take more. And each successful theft made him stronger, added territory and resources and factories to his growing empire. Now turn your attention eastward, to the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. Here ruled another dictator, Joseph Stalin, whose brutality matched Hitler's own. Stalin had spent the 1930s consolidating power through purges that killed millions. His own generals, potential rivals to his authority, had been executed or sent to gulags. The Red Army, though massive, was led by those who had survived through loyalty rather than competence. Stalin watched Hitler's rise with calculating eyes. Ideologically, they were sworn enemies. Nazism and communism were presented as polar opposites. But ideology, Stalin understood, was flexible when survival was at stake. He had approached Britain and France about forming an alliance against Germany. The negotiations had been lukewarm at best. Western democracies distrusted communism nearly as much as they feared fascism. They hesitated. They delayed. They made demands Stalin found unacceptable. So Stalin made a decision that shocked the world. In August of 1939, the foreign ministers of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, it pledged the two nations would not attack each other. Privately, in secret protocols, they divided Eastern Europe between them. Poland, that nation reborn after the Great War, was to be split down the middle. The Baltic states would fall to Soviet influence. Finland, too, was marked on Stalin's map. Understand the cynical brilliance of this move. Stalin had no illusions about Hitler's ultimate intentions. The Nazis had built their ideology on hatred of Bolshevism. Mein Kampf spoke openly of Germany's need for Lebensraum, living space, to be carved from the Soviet Union itself. But this pact bought time. Time for Stalin to rebuild his purged military. Time to move his industrial base beyond the reach of German bombers. Time to prepare for the inevitable collision. For Hitler, the pact solved his greatest strategic problem. Germany could not fight a two-front war. The nightmare of the Great War had been British and French pressure from the west, while Russia ground down Germany's armies in the east. But with Stalin's signature on a treaty, that eastern front was secured. Poland could be invaded without fear of Soviet intervention. Indeed, the Soviets would help themselves to their share of Polish territory. Now shift your gaze to the Pacific. where a different power harbored its own ambitions. Japan, an island nation with limited natural resources, had embraced imperial expansion as a matter of survival. They had modernized with breathtaking speed, transforming from a feudal society to an industrial power within decades. But industrialization demands resources: oil, rubber, iron, the raw materials that fuel factories and feed armies. Japan looked at the map and saw opportunity. China, vast and rich in resources, had been weakened by decades of internal conflict. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion, seizing coastal cities and establishing puppet governments. The brutality of this conquest, exemplified by the massacre at Nanking, revealed the ruthless efficiency of Japanese military doctrine: victory at any cost, expansion as destiny. But China, even divided and weakened, was too vast to fully subdue. The war there became a grinding occupation that consumed resources without resolving Japan's fundamental problem. The oil, the rubber, the resources Japan needed were further south: French Indochina, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. These colonial possessions, rich in everything Japan lacked, became increasingly tempting targets. There was an obstacle, of course. The United States, with its Pacific territories and its growing concern about Japanese aggression, watched with mounting alarm. America imposed sanctions, cutting off the oil exports Japan desperately needed. It was economic warfare, an attempt to force Japan to abandon its Chinese, conquest through pressure rather than military force. But sanctions, Japan's leaders concluded, left them with an impossible choice: submit to American demands and abandon their empire, or strike before their oil reserves ran dry. Consider how these separate dramas were interconnected, how decisions made in Berlin affected calculations in Tokyo, how Stalin's pact with Hitler influenced Britain's strategic planning. The world had become a chessboard, and the pieces were moving into position. In September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland. This time, Britain and France kept their commitments. They declared war. But declarations and action are different things. While Poland fought desperately against German blitzkrieg tactics, coordinated attacks of aircraft and tanks that shattered traditional defences, the British and French armies sat behind their fortifications. They called it the phony war, this strange period of declared war without fighting. They hoped, perhaps, that Hitler might still be reasoned with, that Poland's conquest might satisfy him. Then, from the east, Soviet forces invaded Poland's undefended eastern territories. The secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet pact were being fulfilled. Poland, caught between two predators, was consumed. Its government fled. Its people faced occupation from both Nazi and Soviet forces. The cavalry charges against German tanks, romantic and doomed, became symbols of courage overwhelmed by modernity's machinery. Stalin, having secured his share of Poland, turned north to Finland. He demanded territorial concessions, naval bases, a buffer zone to protect Leningrad. Finland refused. In November of 1939, Soviet forces invaded, expecting quick victory over a small nation. Instead, they encountered fierce resistance. Finnish ski troops, expert in winter warfare, inflicted humiliating casualties on the massive but poorly led Red Army. Eventually, Soviet numbers prevailed, but the war revealed to Hitler something crucial. Stalin's purges had left the Red Army vulnerable. Through the winter of 1939-40, Europe held its breath. Germany had conquered Poland but made no move westward. France and Britain mobilized but did not attack. The phony war continued, this strange suspended animation where nations at war did not fight. People began to wonder if perhaps this conflict might remain limited, a border dispute that would eventually be negotiated. Then spring arrived, and with it, the storm. In April of 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway in a brilliant operation that secured iron ore supplies and naval bases. In May, the real blow fell. German forces swept through the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg, bypassing the Maginot Line, that massive system of French fortifications that had taken decades to build and billions to finance. The French had prepared to fight the last war. They had built fortifications to stop frontal assaults, but the Germans did not assault frontally. They went around. Through the Ardennes forest, thought impassable to tanks, German armour poured into France. Within weeks, the unthinkable had happened. France, victor of the Great War, possessor of what was thought to be the world's finest army, had collapsed. British forces evacuated from Dunkirk in a desperate withdrawal disguised as a miracle. Paris fell. France surrendered. Britain now stood alone. Hitler controlled Europe from the Atlantic to the Soviet border. He had accomplished in months what Germany had failed to do in 4 years of the Great War. The Treaty of Versailles, that document meant to prevent German aggression, had been torn apart. Every limitation, every reparation, every humiliation had been reversed through force. And yet, Britain did not surrender. Under Churchill's leadership, the island nation prepared for invasion. Through the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain was fought in the skies. German bombers, attempting to destroy the Royal Air Force as a prelude to crossing the Channel. They failed. British radar, that crucial technological edge, allowed fighters to intercept bombers with devastating efficiency. Hitler postponed his invasion. Britain had bought time. But time for what? America remained neutral, bound by isolationist sentiment and laws that prohibited direct involvement in European wars. Stalin's Soviet Union had a pact with Hitler. Most of Europe was under Nazi occupation or allied with Germany. Japan continued its expansion in Asia. The pieces on the chessboard were set. The powers had chosen their positions. What none could yet see was how completely the world was about to change. The decisions made in these years, the gambles taken, the alliances forged in cynicism or desperation, would set in motion a conflict unlike any humanity had known. Not a war between armies, though armies would clash on unprecedented scales. Not a war between nations, though nations would be consumed, but a war between incompatible visions of human society itself. Democracy against fascism, communism against capitalism, freedom against tyranny. The Treaty of Versailles had tried to build a peace on punishment. It had created instead the conditions for catastrophe. Hitler's gambles had succeeded because his opponents lacked the will to stop him early, when stopping him would have been possible. Stalin's cynical calculations had given Germany the freedom to conquer the West. Japan's resource desperation was driving it toward collision with America. Each power had made what seemed like logical decisions based on their circumstances. Together, those decisions were leading humanity toward the abyss. In the capitals of the world, in the summer of 1940, strategists studied their maps. They moved pins representing divisions and fleets. They calculated production numbers and resource reserves. They believed they understood the nature of the conflict ahead. They were wrong. The war that was coming would exceed every assumption, shatter every certainty, and demand sacrifices no one was prepared to make. The chessboard was set, the pieces were in motion, and across the globe, ordinary people, going about their lives, working their jobs, raising their children. I had no idea that history was about to sweep them up into the greatest catastrophe civilization had ever known. But before the final moves, before the true horror began, there was still a moment, a breath, a last instant of the world before. Remember it, because what came next would change everything. There is a truth about war that strategists sometimes forget in their focus on tactics and territory. Battles are won by courage and skill, yes, but wars are won by factories, by the capacity to produce more shells than the enemy can fire, more tanks than they can destroy, more aircraft than they can shoot down. The Second World War would be decided not only on battlefields but in the furnaces and assembly lines of industrial nations. It would be a contest of production, and whoever could manufacture war faster would write the terms of peace. In the autumn of 1940, as German bombers struck London night after night, Britain faced a mathematics problem that threatened its survival. The island produced much, but consumed more. Food crossed the Atlantic in merchant ships. Oil came from distant wells. Raw materials, the copper and steel and rubber that kept factories running, all had to be imported. And German submarines, U-boats, prowling beneath cold waters, were sinking those ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. Consider the predicament. Every cargo vessel that failed to reach port was not merely a tactical loss. It was food that would not feed workers, fuel that would not power factories, materials that could not become weapons. Britain was slowly being strangled, and Winston Churchill knew that courage alone could not break a blockade. His nation needed help. Massive help. The kind of industrial support that only one nation on earth could provide. The United States, in those early years of war, maintained a careful neutrality. The memory of the Great War, of American boys dying in European mud, remained fresh enough to fuel powerful isolationist sentiment. Laws had been passed to ensure America would not be drawn into foreign conflicts through financial entanglement. Nations at war could purchase American goods, but only with cash, and they had to transport those goods themselves. Cash and carry, it was called, a policy that seemed to keep America safely distant from Europe's catastrophe. But Franklin Roosevelt, watching from across the Atlantic, understood what was at stake. If Britain fell, Hitler would control all of Europe. The entire industrial capacity of a continent would be turned toward whatever ambitions the Nazi regime harbored next. Roosevelt knew America could not remain an island of peace in a world dominated by fascism. Yet he also knew his country was not ready for war, neither militarily nor politically. So he found another way. In March of 1941, the Lend-Lease Act became law. It was a masterpiece of political creativity. America would lend or lease war materials to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to American security. Britain would not need cash. Repayment could be deferred until after the war, in forms to be determined later. It was, Roosevelt explained to the American people, like lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. You did not demand payment while flames still raged. You helped extinguish the fire, knowing that your own house would be safer as a result. The implications were staggering. American factories, which had been idling since the Great Depression, suddenly had orders on a scale that defied imagination. Tens of thousands of aircraft, thousands of tanks, mountains of ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything an army needed to wage modern war. British merchant ships began arriving at American ports to load cargo they did not have to pay for, at least not immediately. But this was only the beginning. Roosevelt understood that aid alone would not be enough. America itself would need to mobilize, to transform its peacetime economy into something the world had never seen, a true arsenal of democracy. The industrial capacity that had built automobiles and refrigerators would now build bombers and battleships. Watch how it unfolded. In cities across America, factories retooled. The Ford plant in Willow Run, built specifically to manufacture B-24 bombers, became the largest room under one roof anywhere in the world. At peak production, a new bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. One complete aircraft, from raw materials to flight ready, every single hour. It was a pace that seemed impossible, yet month after month, they sustained it. Shipyards multiplied along both coasts. The Kaiser shipyards pioneered mass production techniques for cargo vessels, the Liberty ships that would carry supplies across oceans. These ships, built from prefabricated sections welded together, could be completed in weeks rather than months. At the peak of production, 3 ships were launched every single day. Some were sunk by submarines before making a second voyage. It did not matter. More ships were being built than the Germans could sink. Consider the scale of this transformation. In 1939, American factories produced fewer than 6,000 military aircraft. In 1944, they produced nearly 100,000. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, weapons of every description poured from assembly lines in quantities that made earlier production look quaint. When Stalin received reports of American industrial output, he initially dismissed them as propaganda. No nation could produce so much. But the supplies kept arriving, convoy after convoy, and eventually, even Stalin had to accept the impossible numbers were real. This mobilization required more than machines and materials. It required workers. Millions of men were being drafted into military service, leaving factories understaffed precisely when production demands exploded. The solution came from an unexpected source: women. In factories across America, women who had been homemakers, teachers, clerks, took positions as welders, riveters, machinists. They proved as capable as the men they replaced, and often more precise in their work. Rosie the riveter became more than a poster. She was a symbol of transformation, of a society discovering that capability was not limited by gender, that necessity could shatter assumptions held for generations. 60% of the workforce in some aircraft factories was female. They worked long shifts, managed households, raised children, and built the machines that would win the war. Their contribution would be conveniently forgotten in the years after peace, but during the war itself, they were essential. Now turn your attention to Germany, where a different economic model was in operation. Hitler had conquered most of Europe, and he intended to make that conquest profitable. The territories under Nazi control were not occupied. They were exploited. French factories were commandeered to produce for Germany. Polish coal mines worked for German industry. The agricultural output of Ukraine was meant to feed German soldiers and workers. This was systematic extraction on a continental scale. In occupied nations, food was rationed to starvation levels while the surplus went to Germany. Workers were conscripted, sent to German factories as slave labor. Entire economies were reorganized around a single purpose: sustaining the German war machine. It was brutal, efficient, and ultimately unsustainable. Consider the flaw in this system. Slave labor, workers forced to toil under threat of death, is not productive labor. They have no incentive to work well, every incentive to sabotage quietly when possible. Equipment breaks, quality suffers. Production numbers look impressive on paper, but the actual output is less reliable. German factories using forced labor had constant problems with defects and breakdowns that slowed production. Moreover, exploitation breeds resistance. In every occupied nation, underground movements formed. Resistance fighters sabotaged railways, attacked supply depots, assassinated collaborators. The Germans had to dedicate massive resources to security. Troops that could have been fighting at the front instead spent hunting partisans in occupied territory. The economics of empire, Hitler discovered, were more complicated than simply taking what you wanted. Yet Germany did manage impressive production. Its factories, even while being bombed by Allied aircraft, continued to churn out tanks and weapons. Production actually increased in 1944 despite the bombing campaign, a testament to German engineering and organizational ability. They dispersed factories, moved production underground, kept the machinery running even as cities burned. But there was a ceiling on German production that no amount of efficiency could overcome. Resources were finite. Oil, particularly, was Germany's vulnerability. Hitler's forces ran on petroleum, but Germany had limited domestic supplies. They synthesized fuel from coal, a costly process. They relied on Romanian oil fields, vulnerable to air attack and Soviet advance. Every litre of fuel consumed by tanks on the Eastern Front was a litre not available for aircraft in the West or ships in the Mediterranean. In the Pacific, Japan faced even more severe economic constraints. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as Japan called its empire, was meant to secure the resources the home islands lacked. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. The propaganda spoke of Asian peoples throwing off, Western colonialism and prospering together under Japanese leadership. The reality was extraction as thorough as anything European powers had practiced, and considerably more brutal. Japan's industrial base, however, was fundamentally smaller than America's. Japanese factories had been built rapidly, but lacked the depth and diversity of American industry. They could produce excellent aircraft and warships. The Zero fighter was superior to anything America had at the war's start. Japanese torpedoes were the finest in the world, but they could not produce them in sufficient quantities. Consider the aircraft carrier, that capital ship that would dominate Pacific warfare. Building a carrier required massive industrial resources: steel for the hull, specialized equipment for the flight deck, engines, electronics, trained workers who understood complex systems. The United States could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. When Japan lost 4 carriers at Midway in June of 1942, it was a catastrophe from which their navy never recovered, not just because of the ships themselves, but because those ships could not be replaced quickly. The skilled pilots who went down with them could not be replaced at all. America, by contrast, could absorb losses that would cripple other nations. The Essex-class carriers, produced in numbers that seemed excessive even to American planners, ensured that sinkings were inconveniences rather than disasters. By war's end, the United States had more carriers in service than all other nations combined had built in total. It was production on a scale that made naval battles almost unfair. The Soviet Union represented yet another model of war economy. Stalin had spent the 1930s industrializing at breakneck pace. Entire factories had been built in the Urals, beyond the reach of German bombers. When Germany invaded in June of 1941, Soviet industry faced its greatest test. Factories in western regions were dismantled, loaded onto trains, moved east, and reassembled. Workers and their families travelled with the machinery, often living in primitive conditions while production resumed. The Soviet approach to production was quantity over refinement. The 34 tank was not the most advanced design, but it was reliable, easy to produce, and effective in combat. Soviet factories built them by the thousands, accepting that many would be destroyed but knowing that replacements were always coming. Soviet artillery pieces, aircraft, small arms, all followed this philosophy. Good enough, and more of them than the enemy could destroy. Lend-lease supplies from America proved crucial to Soviet survival. Trucks particularly transformed Soviet logistics. American Studebaker trucks carried supplies and troops, freeing Soviet factories to focus on weapons rather than transport. Food shipments kept Soviet workers fed. Raw materials supplemented domestic supplies. Stalin would downplay this aid after the war, but during the conflict he acknowledged it was essential. Britain, meanwhile, performed its own industrial miracle under siege. British factories produced Spitfires and Hurricanes, the fighters that won the Battle of Britain. They built tanks and ships, and the vast array of equipment modern warfare demanded. But Britain was smaller than Germany, with a smaller population and industrial base. They could not match German production on their own, which is why American aid was not merely helpful but existential. The British contribution went beyond production numbers. Their scientists and engineers developed technologies that multiplied the effectiveness of their forces. Radar, mentioned earlier, gave British fighters crucial minutes of warning. The Merlin engine, powering both British and American aircraft, was a masterpiece of engineering. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, about whom we will speak more later, provided intelligence that saved countless ships and lives. Consider the global nature of this economic warfare. Resources moved from every continent. Australian wheat fed British soldiers. Indian textiles clothed armies. Brazilian rubber kept vehicles moving. South African gold financed operations. The war was fought on battlefields, yes, but it was sustained by a web of commerce and industry spanning the planet. The Battle of the Atlantic exemplified this economic dimension of warfare. German U-boats targeted merchant ships not primarily to kill sailors, but to destroy cargo. Every ship sunk was material that would not reach Britain. Production capacity wasted, resources lost to the ocean floor. The Allies protected convoys with warships and aircraft, hunted submarines with increasingly sophisticated technology, and built ships faster than they were sunk. It was mathematics made lethal, tonnage calculations determining whether nations survived or starved. By 1943, the economic contest had a clear direction. America's production was reaching full stride. Soviet factories, recovered from their relocation, were outproducing Germany in most categories. Britain, still under pressure but sustained by American aid, maintained its contribution. The Axis powers, conversely, were reaching their limits. Germany could not replace losses while fighting on multiple fronts. Japan's merchant fleet, essential for transporting resources from conquered territories to the home islands, was being systematically destroyed by American submarines. There is a moment in every war when defeat becomes inevitable, even if the fighting continues. For the Axis powers, that moment arrived when their enemy's production capacity so exceeded their own that military skill could no longer compensate. You can be the finest tactician in history, but if your opponent has 10 tanks for every one of yours, 10 aircraft for every one of yours, 10 shells for every one you can fire, skill becomes insufficient. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In total war production, the United States outproduced Germany and Japan combined. Soviet production, once factories were relocated and retooled, exceeded Germany's despite the enormous territory lost to invasion. Britain, though smaller, maintained production levels that contributed significantly to Allied victory. The Axis powers, for all their early advantages, never approached these numbers. But numbers alone do not capture the human dimension of this industrial mobilization. Consider the worker in a Detroit factory, building bombers through night shifts, knowing that the aircraft leaving the assembly line might be flying over Germany within weeks. Consider the Soviet worker in a Urals factory, living in a barracks, working 12-hour shifts, sustained by the knowledge that every tank built pushed the Germans further back. Consider the British worker in a Midlands factory, hearing air raid sirens, continuing work because stopping meant letting the enemy win. They were not soldiers, these factory workers. They would receive no medals for their service, yet their contribution was as vital as any infantry advance or air raid. The war was won by those who fought, certainly, but it was made winnable by those who built the means to fight. The Manhattan Project, that secret endeavor to build an atomic weapon, represented the ultimate expression of industrial and scientific mobilization. Thousands of workers, most not knowing what they were building, participated in creating something that would change warfare forever. The cost approached $2 billion, roughly $30 billion in modern currency. Only America had the resources to pursue such a project, while simultaneously fighting a global war. By war's end, the economic transformation was complete. America had become an industrial colossus, its economy larger than all other major powers combined. Soviet industry, built through immense sacrifice, had proven its capacity. Britain, though exhausted, had sustained its industrial contribution throughout. Germany and Japan, despite fighting with determination, had been buried under production they could never match. The lesson was clear to any who cared to learn it. Modern war was industrial war, Victory went not to the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant generals, though both mattered enormously. Victory went to the nations that could produce more, faster, and keep producing even while under attack. The battles visible on maps were supported by battles invisible in factories and shipyards and mines, contests of production where the stakes were no less than the survival of nations and ideologies. This was the hidden war, the struggle in forges and on assembly lines, the economic dimension of conflict that transformed civilian workers into warriors in their own right. They built the arsenal of democracy. They sustained the Soviet war machine. They kept Britain fighting when invasion seemed imminent, and in doing so, they demonstrated that in total war, entire societies mobilize, and victory belongs to those who can sustain the effort longest. The chessboard had been set by political decisions and military movements, but the pieces themselves, the tanks and ships and aircraft that would fight the battles, came from this economic warfare. And in this contest of production, the ultimate outcome was determined long before the final shots were fired. There exists a peculiar irony in warfare. The deadliest weapon is often invisible. A bullet can kill one soldier, a bomb can destroy a building, but information, properly used, can sink fleets, redirect armies, and shorten wars by years. The Second World War was fought with tanks and aircraft, certainly, but it was also fought with codes and ciphers, with deception and intelligence, with the patient work of analysts who never fired a shot yet saved countless lives. In the rolling countryside of Buckinghamshire, England, an estate called Bletchley Park became the site of Britain's most valuable secret. Here, in a collection of temporary buildings and requisitioned mansion rooms, mathematicians and linguists waged a war against German encryption. Their enemy was not flesh and blood, but mathematics itself, the complex systems the Germans used to encode their military communications. The Germans believed their Enigma machine produced unbreakable codes. It was an elegant device, a typewriter connected to rotors that scrambled each letter through billions of possible combinations. When a German operator typed a message, the machine encrypted it. The receiving operator, with rotors set to the same initial position, could decrypt it instantly. But anyone intercepting the transmission saw only gibberish, meaningless letters that revealed nothing. Consider the German confidence in this system. They transmitted orders, positions, battle plans, all by radio, knowing the British could intercept the signals. It did not matter. Without knowing the rotor settings, which changed daily, decryption was mathematically impossible, or so the Germans believed. But the British had advantages the Germans did not realize. Polish mathematicians, before Poland fell, had made early breakthroughs in understanding Enigma's logic. They shared this knowledge with the British, giving Bletchley Park a foundation to build upon. Then there was Alan Turing, a brilliant mathematician who approached code-breaking as a problem of logic and probability. He designed machines, electromechanical computers, called bombs, that could test thousands of rotor settings rapidly, searching for combinations that produced sensible German text. The work required more than machines. It required understanding German military procedure, recognizing patterns in how messages were structured. German operators, despite training, were human. They made predictable choices. Weather reports often began with the word Wetter, weather in German. Operators sometimes used girlfriends' names as daily settings. These human elements, tiny predictabilities in a system designed to be random, gave codebreakers the footholds they needed. By 1941, Bletchley Park was regularly reading German military communications, intelligence codenamed Ultra. The value was almost beyond measure. British commanders knew where U-boat wolf packs were hunting, allowing convoys to route around them. They knew when German aircraft were being redeployed, revealing strategic intentions. They knew supply levels, morale issues, unit positions. It was as if the British were reading over the shoulders of German commanders as they planned operations. But this treasure came with terrible responsibilities. If Britain acted on ultra-intelligence too obviously, Germany would realize their codes were compromised and change their system. Bletchley Park would go dark, and the advantage would vanish. So Churchill and his commanders faced agonizing decisions. Sometimes they had to allow German operations to succeed, had to let ships be sunk or cities bombed, because preventing them would reveal the source of British knowledge. Coventry became the symbol of this cruel calculus. In November of 1940, ultra-intelligence revealed that a major raid was planned against a British city, codenamed Moonlight Sonata. The target was not initially clear, but eventually evidence pointed toward Coventry, an industrial city in the Midlands. Churchill faced a choice: evacuate the city and risk the Germans realizing their codes were broken, or allow the raid to proceed and preserve Ultra for future use when it might save even more lives. The raid went ahead. 500 German bombers struck Coventry, destroying the medieval cathedral and much of the city centre. Hundreds died. It was a catastrophe, but Ultra remained secret, and over the following years, the intelligence it provided saved tens of thousands of lives, shortened battles, and arguably shortened the war itself. Consider what this meant for those making such decisions. You possess knowledge that could save lives today, but using that knowledge might cost more lives tomorrow. You must calculate, coldly, which choice serves the greater good. It is the mathematics of suffering, and there are no clean answers. The importance of Ultra became most evident in the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats nearly strangled Britain through 1942. Merchant ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. But as codebreakers became more proficient at reading German naval codes, the tide shifted. Convoys could be routed away from U-boat patrol lines. Anti-submarine forces could be directed to areas where U-boats were operating. The hunters became the hunted. German Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, became convinced the British had some method of detecting his submarines. He suspected radar, or perhaps spies in French ports where U-boats refueled. He never seriously considered that his codes were being read. The Enigma system was too sophisticated, too mathematically complex. The failure of imagination cost Germany dearly. By mid-1943, U-boat losses were unsustainable. The Battle of the Atlantic was won, not by superior weapons or tactics alone, but by information. Yet intelligence warfare was not limited to code-breaking. The Germans had their own intelligence successes, particularly in the war's early years. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, ran networks of agents across Europe and beyond. They gathered information on Allied production, troop movements, strategic plans. But German intelligence suffered from a fatal flaw. It told Hitler what he wanted to hear. When intelligence contradicted Hitler's beliefs, he dismissed it. Before invading the Soviet Union, intelligence estimates suggested Soviet military strength was far greater than Hitler acknowledged. He ignored these assessments, convinced of Soviet weakness. The result was catastrophic for Germany when the Red Army proved far more formidable than expected. Intelligence is only valuable if leaders are willing to believe unwelcome truths. The Americans brought their own approach to intelligence gathering. They had broken Japanese naval codes before the war began. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, it was not because American codebreakers had failed. Messages had been intercepted and decrypted. The problem was analysis and dissemination. The warnings existed but did not reach the right people in time to prepare defenses. It was a failure of process rather than capability, and the lesson was learned at terrible cost. By mid-1942, American codebreakers were reading Japanese naval communications with the same proficiency their British counterparts applied to German messages. The intelligence, codenamed Magic, provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with knowledge that proved decisive at Midway. He knew the Japanese were planning a major operation against Midway Island. He knew the composition of their forces, their approach route, their timing. When the Japanese fleet arrived, American carriers were waiting. The Battle of Midway, in June of 1942, destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and shifted momentum in the Pacific. It was a victory enabled by intelligence. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto had planned brilliantly, but he had planned against an enemy who would react to events as they unfolded. Instead, the Americans knew his plan before it began and positioned their forces accordingly. The most perfect operation is worthless if the enemy knows what you intend to do. Now consider an entirely different form of intelligence warfare: deception. If knowledge of enemy plans is valuable, imagine the value of making the enemy believe false information about your own plans. Operation Fortitude, the deception campaign supporting D-Day in June of 1944, represents perhaps the finest achievement in the history of military deception. The Allies knew they would invade France. The Germans knew it too. The question was where and when. If Germany could concentrate its forces at the invasion site, the landing might be repulsed and the war prolonged by years. The Allies needed Germany to expect invasion at the wrong place, to keep forces dispersed until the real landings were established. Operation Fortitude created an entirely fictional army group positioned in southeast England across from Calais, the narrowest part of the English Channel. This phantom force, supposedly commanded by General George Patton, was built from inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and double agents feeding false information to German intelligence. The Germans, reading these signals and receiving reports from their agents, believed a massive force was preparing to invade at Calais. The detail was extraordinary. Entire fictitious units had histories, commanders, insignia. Radio operators transmitted according to patterns that suggested military formations. Reconnaissance flights photographed the fake equipment. Every element was designed to create a picture in German minds of an invasion force larger than the actual one assembling further west in Normandy. When the real invasion came at Normandy on June 6, 1944, German commanders hesitated. Was this the main landing, or a diversion before the real attack at Calais? Hitler himself believed Normandy was a feint. He held panzer divisions in reserve near Calais for weeks after D-Day, waiting for the invasion that would never come. By the time he realized his error, Allied forces were established in France. The deception had bought crucial time. Consider the patience required for such operations. Fortitude took months to prepare. Double agents had to be carefully managed, their false information plausible enough to be believed without being too valuable. The fake radio. Traffic had to maintain consistency over time. One mistake, one inconsistency, noticed by German intelligence, and the entire operation could unravel. Technology provided another dimension to intelligence warfare. Radar, that British innovation mentioned earlier, revolutionized aerial combat. It was not merely a defensive tool. Radar allowed British fighters to be scrambled with precision timing to intercept German bombers at optimal moments. It eliminated the need for standing patrols, conserving fuel, and pilot fatigue. The German Luftwaffe, fighting over Britain in 1940, never understood why British fighters seemed to appear exactly when and where they were needed. Radar's existence was so closely guarded that the British spread false stories about their pilots eating carrots to improve night vision. A deliberate misdirection to protect the technology. The Germans developed their own radar systems eventually, but they were always a step behind. By the time they deployed coastal radar to detect incoming Allied bombers, the Allies had developed window, strips of aluminum foil dropped from aircraft that created false returns on radar screens. German radar operators saw what appeared to be hundreds of aircraft when only dozens existed, or missed real bombers hidden among clouds of false signals. Technology and counter-technology evolved in rapid succession, each side seeking advantage in the invisible spectrum. Economic intelligence played a crucial role often overlooked in dramatic accounts of the war. Allied intelligence services tracked German production, identified critical industries, and directed bombing raids accordingly. Ball-bearing factories became high-priority targets because modern weapons required precision bearings. Synthetic fuel plants were struck repeatedly to limit German mobility. The intelligence work was painstaking, analyzing photographs, interviewing refugees and escaped prisoners, piecing together understanding of German industrial capacity. The Americans brought systematic analysis to this work. The Office of Strategic Services, forerunner of the CIA, combined intelligence gathering with analysis. They recruited economists, historians, anthropologists, people who could interpret information in contexts beyond military affairs. What did German railway traffic patterns reveal about troop movements? What did rationing announcements suggest about resource shortages? Intelligence became a discipline combining multiple fields of knowledge. Human intelligence, the work of spies and resistance networks, provided information technology could not capture. Agents in occupied territories reported on German fortifications, troop morale, and civilian attitudes. The French resistance passed information on German military movements, often at terrible risk. Captured agents faced interrogation, torture, execution, yet the networks persisted, motivated by a mixture of patriotism, ideology, and simple defiance of occupation. The Soviet Union ran extensive intelligence networks, both in occupied territories and in Allied nations. Soviet spies penetrated the Manhattan Project, providing Stalin with atomic secrets even before the first bomb was tested. This intelligence shaped post-war relations, giving the Soviet Union knowledge that accelerated their own atomic program. Espionage continued even among allies, a reminder that cooperation in war did not mean complete trust. Consider the layered nature of this intelligence warfare. At the bottom layer, raw information, intercepted messages, reconnaissance photographs, agent reports. Above this, analysis. What does the information mean? What patterns emerge? What can be predicted? At the top layer, decision. How should this intelligence be used? What action should it prompt? Each layer required different skills, and failure at any level could waste the efforts of all the others. The intelligence war had its failures too. Allied intelligence seriously underestimated German rocket development. When Von flying bombs and V-2 rockets began falling on London in 1944, it was a shock. The weapons arrived without warning and could not be stopped by conventional air defenses. Intelligence had detected evidence of German rocket programs, but had not grasped how advanced they were or how soon they would be deployed. Similarly, the Japanese managed some deceptions of their own. American intelligence believed Japanese carrier strength was greater than it actually was after Midway, leading to cautious strategies that might not have been necessary. The fog of war included uncertainty even with good intelligence. Information had to be interpreted, and interpretation could be wrong. Yet overall, the intelligence balance favored the Allies, particularly by the war's later years. The cumulative effect of reading enemy codes, deceiving enemy intelligence, developing superior technology, and analyzing information systematically gave Allied commanders advantages German and Japanese leaders lacked. They could plan with better information, react more quickly to changing circumstances, and allocate resources more efficiently. There is a counterfactual question worth contemplating. How much longer would the war have lasted without Ultra, without Magic, without Operation Fortitude, and similar deceptions? The codebreakers at Bletchley Park, working in secrecy, never knowing if their efforts mattered, likely shortened the war by 2 years. 2 years fewer of combat deaths, of aerial bombardment, of concentration camps operating. Millions of lives saved by mathematics and patience, and brilliance applied to the problem of reading enemy minds through their encrypted communications. The intelligence warriors left fewer monuments than soldiers did. There are no grand cemeteries for codebreakers, no memorials to double agents. Many worked in secrecy that extended decades beyond the war itself, forbidden from speaking of their contributions. Yet their impact was profound. They proved that knowledge was power, that information properly used could be worth divisions of troops or squadrons of aircraft. In the end, the intelligence war demonstrated a truth that remains relevant. In any conflict, seeing clearly while obscuring your opponent's vision provides advantage that technology alone cannot deliver. The side that knows what the enemy plans while concealing its own intentions fights with a decisive edge. Germany and Japan possessed excellent intelligence services, skilled officers, sophisticated equipment, but they fought increasingly blind, while their enemies saw with growing clarity. The war was won on battlefields, yes, but those battles were made winnable by invisible combat waged in code rooms and photography labs, by agents risking everything to send reports, by analysts finding patterns in seemingly random data. The secret war, the intelligence war, the patient work of making truth visible while keeping falsehood plausible, this was as vital to victory as any campaign marked on maps. And the lessons learned, the techniques developed, the understanding that information itself could be weaponized and that knowledge could be worth more than firepower, these lessons would shape how nations approached conflict for generations to come. The Second World War was the last great conflict fought partially in ignorance. Future wars would be intelligence wars first, with military action following from information advantage. The shadow game played out in signals and codes, and carefully managed deceptions had become central to modern warfare, and there would be no going back. History hinges on decisions. A choice made in one moment echoes across years, reshaping the fate of nations and the lives of millions. In war, these decisions become amplified, their consequences measured in territory gained or lost, in lives saved or spent. The Second World War was decided not by any single battle, but by a series of strategic choices, some brilliant, some catastrophically flawed, each one altering the trajectory of the conflict in ways that could not be undone. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Adolf Hitler made a decision that would ultimately destroy the Third Reich. He invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, sent 3 million German soldiers crashing across Soviet borders along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, and it failed. Consider the logic that led to this moment. Hitler had always viewed the Soviet Union as Germany's natural enemy. His ideology painted Slavic peoples as inferior, their land as Lebensraum, living space for German expansion. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 had been a temporary convenience, a way to secure Germany's eastern border while dealing with France and Britain. But Hitler never intended it to last. In his mind, the destruction of Bolshevism and the conquest of Soviet territory were inevitable. Moreover, he believed the Soviet Union was weak. Stalin's purges had decimated the Red Army's officer corps. The poor performance against Finland in the Winter War suggested Soviet military incompetence. German intelligence estimated the Red Army would collapse within weeks of invasion. 6 months at most, Hitler's generals assured him. They would strike before winter, destroy Soviet forces in a series of massive encirclement battles, and seize Moscow before snow fell. What they failed to grasp was the sheer size of what they were attempting. The Soviet Union was vast beyond German experience. When encircled armies were destroyed, new armies appeared from the depths of the country. When frontline divisions were shattered, reserve units took their positions. The Germans advanced hundreds of miles, captured millions of prisoners, inflicted casualties that would have broken any European nation. The Soviet Union absorbed these losses and continued fighting. The Russian winter of 1941 became legendary. But it was not the cold alone that stopped the German advance. It was logistics. German supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of primitive roads. Soviet railways used a different gauge than European trains, forcing Germans to transship supplies at the border or lay new track. Trucks broke down. Horses, still the primary means of moving supplies for much of the German army, died from exhaustion and cold. Units reached the outskirts of Moscow in December, so close they could see the Kremlin's spires, and then stalled because they lacked fuel, ammunition, winter clothing. The Soviet counteroffensive that winter pushed German forces back from Moscow. It was the first major German defeat of the war, and it shattered the myth of German invincibility. But more importantly, it demonstrated that Germany could not win a quick victory. The war in the East would continue, grinding down German strength month after month, year after year. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union created the two-front war Germany could not win. In the West, Britain remained undefeated, receiving American aid, bombing German cities, tying down German forces. In the East, the Soviet Union traded space for time, pulling German armies deeper into territories where supply lines could not sustain them. Germany was strong, but not strong enough to fight the world. Consider the counterfactual. If Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union, if he had consolidated control of Western Europe, built up defenses, focused on defeating Britain and keeping America out of the war, what then? It is impossible to know, but the strategic situation would have been radically different. Instead, Hitler chose to fight on two fronts simultaneously, dividing his forces, exhausting his resources, and creating the conditions for his own destruction. Now turn your attention to the Pacific, where another decision proved equally decisive. In June of 1942, Admiral Yamamoto commanded the Japanese fleet in an operation to capture Midway Island, a small atoll northwest of Hawaii. It was meant to be the knockout blow against American naval power, forcing the United States to negotiate peace on Japanese terms. Yamamoto had planned meticulously. His fleet was the most powerful ever assembled. 4 large carriers, battleships, cruisers, submarines, hundreds of aircraft. The Americans, he knew, had at most 3 carriers available. The Japanese would draw them into battle and destroy them. Midway would fall. The American will to fight would break. But as we discussed in the previous chapter, the Americans knew Yamamoto's plan. They had broken Japanese naval codes. Admiral Nimitz knew where the Japanese fleet would approach, when they would arrive, on the composition of their forces. He positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, waiting. The battle itself was decided in 5 minutes. American dive bombers, having searched the ocean desperately for the Japanese carriers, found them at a moment of maximum vulnerability. Japanese aircraft were being refueled and rearmed on the carrier decks. Fuel lines were open. Bombs and torpedoes were exposed. The American bombs fell among this chaos. 3 carriers exploded into flames within minutes. A 4th was destroyed later that day. 4 fleet carriers lost. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Thousands of skilled pilots killed. It was a catastrophe from which Japan never recovered. Not because carriers and aircraft could not be replaced eventually, but because the replacement cycle could not keep pace with American production. Every Japanese loss was irreplaceable in practical terms. Every American loss could be made good within months. Yamamoto's decision to concentrate his fleet for a decisive battle had been logical. Japanese doctrine favored such decisive encounters, believing that warrior spirit and superior training could overcome material disadvantage. But the Battle of Midway revealed the flaw in this thinking. Material did matter, production capacity mattered, and when your opponent knew your plans before you executed them, skill alone was insufficient. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive. American forces began the slow advance across the Pacific, seizing islands, moving closer to the Japanese home islands. Each battle cost both sides heavily, but America could sustain losses that bled Japan white. The decision to seek a decisive naval battle had backfired catastrophically. In Europe, another strategic decision altered the war's course. The invasion of Italy in September of 1943. Allied leaders had debated where to strike next after clearing North Africa. Stalin demanded a second front in France to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. Churchill advocated for attacking through what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, meaning Italy. The decision to invade Italy was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. It was not the direct assault on France that Stalin wanted, and that would most effectively draw German forces away from the Eastern Front. But neither was it an easy campaign. Italy proved to have no soft underbelly. The mountainous terrain favoured defence. German forces fought a masterful delaying action, retreating slowly up the peninsula, making the Allies pay for every mile with casualties and time. Yet the Italian campaign served purposes beyond the immediate military objectives. It kept Allied forces engaged, maintaining pressure on Germany from multiple directions. It knocked Italy out of the war, though Italian forces had been more liability than asset to Germany by that point, and it provided experience in large-scale amphibious operations that would prove valuable for the eventual invasion of France. The decision to invade Italy rather than France directly in 1943 delayed the opening of the true Second Front by a year. That delay cost Soviet lives, as the Red Army bore the brunt of German military power through another year of grinding combat. But it also meant that when D-Day came in June of 1944, Allied forces were better prepared, better equipped, and facing a German army already weakened by years of Eastern Front combat. Stalin's own strategic decisions shaped the war as profoundly as any. When Germany invaded in 1941, Stalin's initial response was paralysis. He had ignored warnings of the invasion, dismissed intelligence reports, and left Soviet forces unprepared. The early disasters, the millions of prisoners taken in the first months, resulted partly from this failure of preparation. But Stalin learned, and he made a crucial strategic choice. Trade space for time. The Soviet Union would retreat, destroying infrastructure as it went, pulling German forces deeper into territory where logistics became impossible. Soviet industry would be relocated east, beyond German reach. The Red Army would suffer terrible losses but would not break. Winter and distance would defeat the invaders as they had defeated Napoleon. This strategy required accepting catastrophic losses. Entire cities were destroyed. Millions of civilians died in the occupied territories. The suffering was almost beyond comprehension. But the strategy worked. By the time German forces reached the limits of their advance, they were exhausted, overextended, vulnerable to counterattack. The Battle of Stalingrad, from August 1942 to February 1943, exemplified this strategy. The city itself had limited strategic value, but Stalin forbade retreat and Hitler ordered his forces to take it at any cost. The battle became a symbol, a test of will between dictators. German and Soviet forces fought building by building, room by room, in combat of unprecedented brutality. When Soviet forces finally encircled the German army in Stalingrad, Hitler forbade breakout attempts. The entire Sixth Army, 300,000 men, was lost. Stalingrad was a turning point not because it was the largest battle, though it was among the largest, but because it demonstrated that Germany could be beaten in sustained combat. The myth of German superiority died in Stalingrad's ruins. From that point forward, the Soviet advance was essentially continuous. There would be setbacks certainly, but the overall direction was westward, toward Berlin. Consider now perhaps the most consequential strategic decision of the entire war, the decision to develop atomic weapons. In August of 1939, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt, warning that nuclear fission might enable bombs of unprecedented power and that Germany might be working to develop such weapons. Roosevelt authorized initial research. After America entered the war, the project expanded dramatically. The Manhattan Project became the largest scientific endeavor in history. It employed hundreds of thousands of workers, cost billions of dollars, required breakthroughs in physics, chemistry, metallurgy, and engineering. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, became entire industrial complexes dedicated to producing fissile material. Los Alamos, New Mexico, housed the scientists who would design the actual weapons. The decision to pursue atomic weapons was not merely about winning the war, it was about the post-war world. By 1945, victory over Germany and Japan was certain. The question was at what cost, and who would shape the peace. An atomic weapon would give America unprecedented leverage in post-war negotiations. It would deter Soviet expansion. It would make invasion of Japan unnecessary, saving hundreds of thousands of American lives. In July of 1945, the first atomic bomb was tested in the New Mexico desert. The explosion exceeded expectations. Scientists who had calculated its power intellectually now witnessed the reality. A flash brighter than the sun, a fireball that reached into the stratosphere, a shockwave felt miles away. Robert Oppenheimer, the project's scientific director, recalled a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The decision to use these weapons against Japan was controversial then, and remained so. By summer of 1945, Japan was defeated. Its navy was destroyed. Its cities were being firebombed. Soviet entry into the war was imminent. Some argued Japan would surrender without invasion or atomic weapons. Others argued that Japanese military culture would fight to the last, that invasion would cost millions of lives on both sides, that only shock would force surrender. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, another destroyed Nagasaki. The death toll from both bombs exceeded 200,000, most of them civilians. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. The decision to develop and use atomic weapons changed warfare fundamentally. For the first time, humanity possessed the means to destroy itself completely. Future wars would occur in the shadow of nuclear annihilation. The strategic calculations that had governed conflict for millennia no longer applied. Deterrence replaced victory as the goal. Survival became more important than triumph. Each of these strategic turning points, these decisions that changed everything, shared common elements. They were made with incomplete information, under pressure, by leaders who could not fully predict consequences. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, believing in quick victory. Yamamoto sought decisive battle at Midway, expecting to destroy American carriers. Allied leaders invaded Italy as a compromise between competing strategies. Stalin traded space for time because he had no alternative. American leaders developed atomic weapons because they feared the consequences of not doing so. And in each case, the decision, once made, created a new reality that could not be undone. You cannot uninvade the Soviet Union once German forces are committed. You cannot recover carriers sunk at Midway. You cannot withdraw from Italy without admitting strategic failure. You cannot undo the relocation of Soviet industry or the sacrifices of Stalingrad. You cannot unknow how to build atomic weapons. The war was a cascade of such decisions, each one narrowing future options, each one making some outcomes more likely and others impossible. By 1943, Germany could not win. The question was only how long defeat would take and how much it would cost. By 1944, Japan could not win. The atomic bombs decided not whether Japan would lose, but how that loss would occur. There is a lesson here about the nature of strategic decision-making. The most important choices are often irreversible. They commit nations to courses of action that unfold over years. A leader making such decisions must consider not only immediate consequences, but how those consequences will constrain future options. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union seemed logical based on his ideology and his assessment of Soviet weakness. It proved catastrophic because he failed to consider what he would do if quick victory proved impossible. Similarly, Yamamoto's decision to seek decisive battle at Midway was consistent with Japanese naval doctrine, but it failed to account for the possibility that the Americans might know his plans, or that a single bad day could cripple Japanese carrier strength irreparably. Strategic thinking requires imagining failure, planning for worst cases, maintaining flexibility. The leaders who succeeded in this war, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, despite his early failures, understood this. They kept options open, adapted to changing circumstances, did not commit irrevocably to plans that might fail. The strategic turning points of the Second World War teach us that decisions made in moments of crisis echo across decades. The choice to invade the Soviet Union shaped the Cold War. The decision to develop atomic weapons created the nuclear age. The Battle of Midway determined the Pacific War's trajectory. Stalingrad symbolized Soviet sacrifice and German defeat. These were not inevitable outcomes. They resulted from choices, and different choices would have led to different histories. We cannot know what would have happened if Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union, if Yamamoto had not sought battle at Midway, if the Manhattan Project had failed or never been attempted. History does not reveal its alternatives, but we can understand that these decisions, made by individuals under extraordinary pressure, changed the world in ways that persist to this day. The map of Europe, the nuclear arsenals that still exist, the memory of Soviet sacrifice, the relationship between America and Japan, all bear the marks of these strategic turning points. And perhaps most importantly, we can learn that in moments of decision, leaders must think beyond immediate advantages to long-term consequences. The most brilliant tactical victory is worthless if it creates strategic disaster. The safest short-term choice may lead to catastrophe if it forecloses necessary future actions. Strategy is the art of seeing clearly through the fog of the present to the possibilities of the future, and then making choices that keep desirable futures achievable while preventing nightmare scenarios from becoming real. The leaders of the Second World War, for all their intelligence and determination, often failed at this. They made choices that seemed logical in the moment, but proved disastrous in retrospect. We who live in the world shaped by their decisions can at least learn from their successes and failures, understanding that strategic choices matter, that they endure, and that the responsibility of making them demands wisdom beyond mere intelligence, foresight beyond mere knowledge, and humility in the face of consequences that cannot be fully predicted. Consider the improbability of what emerged in the early 1940s: a capitalist democracy, a declining empire, and a communist dictatorship joining together to fight a common enemy. These three powers, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, had little in common beyond their opposition to fascism. Their ideologies were incompatible. Their visions for the post-war world contradicted each other fundamentally, yet they managed to coordinate strategy, share resources, and sustain cooperation long enough to achieve victory. It was, in many ways, as remarkable as any battlefield triumph. The alliance began not from mutual affection, but from shared necessity. Britain stood alone through 1940 and early 1941, surviving but unable to defeat Germany without help. The Soviet Union, after being invaded in June of 1941, faced potential annihilation. The United States, still neutral until December of 1941, watched both struggles with growing concern that a German-dominated Europe and a Japanese-dominated Asia would threaten American security. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Hitler made a decision that sealed his fate. He declared war on the United States. He was not obligated to do so by his treaty with Japan. American attention was focused on the Pacific. Hitler could have remained at peace with America while America dealt with Japan. Instead, he chose to add the world's largest industrial power to his list of enemies. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Germany and America were at war. Now the Grand Alliance was complete. Britain, battered but enduring. The Soviet Union, bleeding but fighting back. America, untouched by invasion and possessing industrial capacity that exceeded both allies combined. Together, they faced Germany, Italy, and Japan, powers that had achieved stunning early successes but lacked the resources for prolonged global war. The first question was where to fight. Stalin, watching German armies devastate Soviet territory, demanded a second front in Western Europe immediately. Open another front, he insisted. Force Germany to divide its forces, relieve pressure on the Red Army. Every month of delay cost Soviet lives. American generals, eager to prove their forces in combat, agreed. Invade France in 1942 or early 1943 at the latest. Churchill disagreed. Britain had already fought Germany and lost, evacuating from Dunkirk in humiliation. Churchill knew what German forces could do. He advocated for peripheral strategy. Attack through North Africa, secure the Mediterranean, weaken Germany gradually before attempting the main invasion. A premature landing in France would be catastrophic, wasting lives and equipment, potentially losing the war. Roosevelt had to mediate between these competing visions. He needed to keep Stalin in the war, needed to prevent the Soviet Union from negotiating separate peace with Germany. But he also needed to husband American strength, not waste it in hasty operations that would fail. The compromise was Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November of 1942. It was not the second front Stalin wanted, but it was action in the West, American and British forces engaging Germans in combat. This pattern of negotiation and compromise characterized the alliance throughout the war. At Casablanca in January of 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill met to plan future operations. Stalin could not attend, too occupied with the battle for Stalingrad. The two Western leaders decided on unconditional surrender as their war aim. No negotiated peace, no compromise with fascism. Fight until complete victory. It was meant to reassure Stalin that the Western Allies would not make separate peace, that all three powers would see the war through to the end. But the decision for unconditional surrender had consequences. It meant Germany and Japan could not negotiate their way out of the war, could not hope for anything except complete defeat. This prolonged the fighting, eliminated any possibility of ending the war through diplomatic means. Some historians argue it was necessary to prevent any resurgence of fascism. Others suggest it made both Germany and Japan fight harder, knowing they had nothing to lose. The relationship between the three leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, was complex and often fraught. Roosevelt viewed himself as mediator between the British Empire and Soviet communism. He believed he could work with Stalin, that personal diplomacy could overcome ideological differences. Churchill was more skeptical, more aware of Soviet ambitions in Eastern Europe, more concerned about what the post-war world would look like. Stalin trusted neither of his allies completely. He believed, with some justification, that they were content to let the Soviet Union bear the brunt of fighting Germany. The delay in opening the second front in France cost millions of Soviet lives. When D-Day finally came in June of 1944, the Eastern Front had been grinding on for 3 years. Soviet forces had bled Germany white, destroyed hundreds of divisions, advanced hundreds of miles. The Western Second Front, when it arrived, faced a German army already weakened by years of Eastern combat. Yet the alliance worked because each member needed the others. The Soviet Union needed American equipment and supplies delivered through Lend-Lease convoys. Trucks, aircraft, food, raw materials arrived in Soviet ports, often at great cost. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk faced German air and submarine attack, bitter cold, and seas that could kill within minutes. Merchant sailors died by the thousands to keep supplies flowing to the Soviet Union. Britain needed American industrial capacity and Soviet sacrifice. Without American production, Britain could not have sustained its war effort. Without the Red Army tying down German forces, Britain could not have survived, much less prevailed. The three powers were locked in interdependence, none able to win alone, all needing the others to survive. At Tehran in November of 1943, the three leaders met in person for the first time. Stalin pressed again for the Second Front in France. This time Roosevelt and Churchill agreed. Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, would occur in spring of 1944. In return, Stalin promised to enter the war against Japan after Germany's defeat. The bargain was struck, but beneath the surface agreements, tensions simmered. The Polish question became a point of particular friction. Poland had been the immediate cause of the war, invaded by both Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. The Polish government in exile, based in London, expected to return to a restored and independent Poland. Stalin had different ideas. He intended to keep the territory he had seized in 1939, compensating Poland with German territory instead. The London Poles would not govern. Stalin would install a communist regime loyal to Moscow. Churchill objected, but he lacked leverage. Soviet forces were liberating Poland, and possession mattered more than principle. Roosevelt tried to mediate but ultimately sided with Stalin on most points. The fate of Poland, like the fate of much of Eastern Europe, would be decided by the position of armies when fighting stopped. Soviet forces were there, Western forces were not. Stalin's vision would prevail. The coordination of military operations required unprecedented cooperation despite these political tensions. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany needed coordination between American daylight bombing and British nighttime raids. Naval operations in the Atlantic required shared intelligence and combined convoy protection. The invasion of France demanded integration of American, British, and Canadian forces under unified command. General Dwight Eisenhower, selected as Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Overlord, exemplified the diplomatic skills required for coalition warfare. He had to manage Montgomery's ego, Patton's aggressiveness, Charles de Gaulle's prickly French pride, all while maintaining coordination with forces whose national traditions and military doctrines differed significantly. His success came not from brilliant tactical innovation, but from his ability to keep allies working together toward common goals. The invasion of France in June of 1944 represented coalition warfare at its most complex. American, British, and Canadian forces landed on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. Airborne troops dropped behind German lines. Naval forces bombarded coastal defences. Deception operations, as we discussed earlier, kept German reserves away from the actual landing sites. It was a symphony of coordination, thousands of moving parts that had to work in harmony. The breakout from Normandy and the advance across France required continued cooperation. American forces drove toward Paris and the German border. British and Canadian forces advanced through Belgium and the Netherlands. Supply became critical, and decisions about who received limited supplies created friction. Montgomery wanted all resources directed to his forces for a thrust into Germany. American generals wanted broader advance on multiple fronts. Eisenhower had to balance competing demands while maintaining alliance cohesion. The Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 tested the alliance in different ways. Germany's surprise offensive broke through American lines, creating a dangerous bulge in Allied positions. British forces were redirected to help contain the breakthrough. Montgomery, temporarily commanding American forces in the northern sector, managed to stabilize the situation, but he then held a press conference suggesting British intervention had saved the day, minimizing American contributions. It created enormous resentment that Eisenhower had to manage carefully. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were advancing steadily westward. The coordination between Eastern and Western offensives was loose at best. Stalin promised offensives to coincide with Western operations, and generally delivered, but strategic decisions were made independently. When Soviet forces entered Eastern Europe, they brought political transformation with them. Communist regimes were established in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. The political map of post-war Europe was being drawn by military occupation. At Yalta, in February of 1945, with victory in sight, the three leaders met to discuss post-war arrangements. Germany would be divided into occupation zones. Elections would be held in liberated nations, though the definition of free elections was interpreted differently by Stalin and the Western leaders. The United Nations would be established as a forum for international cooperation. Stalin confirmed his promise to enter the war against Japan, but the Yalta Conference revealed growing tensions. Roosevelt was dying, obviously ill, though he tried to hide it. Churchill feared Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, but lacked power to prevent it. Stalin was determined to create a security buffer of friendly states around Soviet borders, and friendly, in his definition, meant communist and controlled from Moscow. The compromises reached at Yalta would be interpreted differently by each side, leading to decades of Cold War conflict. Consider what the alliance achieved despite these tensions. They coordinated operations across multiple continents and oceans. They shared intelligence, technology, resources. They subordinated national pride to coalition necessity when absolutely required. The development of the atomic bomb was mostly American, but British scientists contributed crucial early research. Soviet forces bore the brunt of German military power, but American supplies sustained their effort. British intelligence provided advantages all three powers exploited. Yet the alliance was always temporary, a marriage of convenience destined to dissolve when the common enemy was defeated. Roosevelt hoped the United Nations would provide framework for continued cooperation. He imagined the four policemen, America, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, working together to maintain global peace. It was naive, perhaps, but not entirely foolish. The alternative was another war between former allies. The resource allocation decisions within the alliance revealed both cooperation and competition. American Lend-Lease went to both Britain and the Soviet Union, but not equally. Britain received more initially, then Soviet allocations increased as their need became more desperate. China received aid to keep fighting Japan. The decisions about who received what equipment, which operations got priority for supplies, these shaped the course of the war and the political relationships between allies. The Manhattan Project represented a partial failure of alliance cooperation. Britain was informed and some British scientists participated. The Soviet Union was not told, despite being an ally. Soviet intelligence learned of the project through espionage and informed Stalin. This secrecy, while understandable from a security perspective, reinforced Stalin's suspicion that his allies did not fully trust him. It poisoned the post-war relationship before the war even ended. In the Pacific, the alliance was simpler because the Soviet Union was not involved until the war's final days. American and British forces cooperated, with American forces bearing the primary burden. Australian and New Zealand forces contributed significantly. Chinese forces tied down Japanese armies in mainland Asia, but there was no need for the complex three-way negotiations that characterized the European theater. The art of coalition warfare requires balancing national interests against collective goals. Each member of an alliance pursues victory, but also aims to shape the peace advantageously. The United States wanted to prevent future wars, establish international organizations, and open global markets. Britain wanted to preserve its empire, maintain its great power status, and prevent Soviet domination of Europe. The Soviet Union wanted security through territorial buffers, recognition as a great power, and prevention of future invasions. These goals were not entirely compatible, but they were not entirely contradictory either. All three powers wanted to defeat fascism. All three wanted to prevent Germany and Japan from ever threatening world peace again. All three wanted some form of international order that would make another world war less likely. The tragedy was that they could agree on what to destroy, but not on what to build. The alliance that won the Second World War was flawed, fractious, and fundamentally fragile. It held together long enough to achieve victory, but began fracturing before the fighting stopped. By the time Germany surrendered in May of 1945, Soviet forces controlled Eastern Europe and showed no intention of leaving. Western forces controlled Western Europe and showed no intention of accepting Soviet domination of the East. The seeds of Cold War were planted even as World War II ended, yet we should not let knowledge of what came after diminish what was achieved. Three powers with incompatible ideologies and competing interests managed to coordinate strategy well enough to defeat enemies who had conquered most of Europe and Asia. They sustained cooperation through years of war, through disagreements and delays and mutual suspicions. They allocated resources with some degree of fairness, shared intelligence that saved lives, and subordinated national pride to coalition necessity often enough to prevail. The lesson of coalition warfare is that perfect unity is unnecessary. Allies do not need to love each other or share common values in all things. They need only to fear or hate their enemies more than they distrust each other, and to understand that victory is impossible alone. The Grand Alliance of World War II met these minimal requirements. It was enough. In the ruins of Europe and Asia, amid the countless dead and the devastated cities, the alliance had achieved its fundamental purpose. Fascism was defeated. Germany and Japan were crushed. The world, though scarred and exhausted, had survived. What would be built from the wreckage remained to be seen. The alliance that won the war would now face the harder task of winning the peace, and in this endeavour, the differences that had been subordinated to military necessity would emerge in full force. The art of Allied strategy had triumphed in war. Whether it could succeed in peace was an open question, one that would define the next half-century of human history. Victory, when it finally arrived, posed questions as complex as any faced during the war itself. What do you do with a defeated enemy? How do you prevent the conditions that led to war from recurring? How do you rebuild a shattered world while managing the competing interests of victorious powers who no longer share a common enemy? The peace that followed the Second World War would be shaped as much by these questions as by the battles that preceded them. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in. The 1,000-year Reich he had promised lasted 12 years and left Europe in ruins. Cities were reduced to rubble. Millions were dead. Survivors wandered through the wreckage, searching for family, for food, for some sign that normal life might resume. Into this chaos came the occupying powers, faced with the enormous task of managing a defeated nation. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, American, British, and French. Berlin, deep within the Soviet zone, was similarly divided. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, a way to manage Germany until a permanent settlement could be reached. Instead, it became the front line of the emerging Cold War. The Soviet zone would become East Germany, communist and aligned with Moscow. The Western zones would merge into West Germany, democratic and aligned with the Atlantic Alliance. But before division became permanent, there was the question of justice. The Nazi regime had committed crimes unprecedented in scope and barbarity. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable, was revealed as Allied forces liberated concentration camps. The photographs from Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau shocked the world. This was not war as previously understood. This was industrialized genocide, evil on a scale that demanded response. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November of 1945, represented an attempt to create international justice. 24 major Nazi leaders were indicted for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The concept of crimes against humanity was new, established specifically to address atrocities that existing law did not cover. The trials were controversial. Some argued that victors putting the vanquished on trial was merely revenge dressed as justice. Others insisted that the crimes were so monstrous that failing to prosecute would mock the millions who had died. Consider what was being attempted. International law had long recognized that nations could go to war. Treaties governed the conduct of war, protecting prisoners and civilians, in theory if not always in practice. But the idea that individuals could be held criminally responsible for the actions of their government, that following orders was not sufficient defense, this was revolutionary. The Nuremberg trials established precedents that persist today. Leaders can be prosecuted for waging aggressive war, soldiers can be held accountable for atrocities, and crimes against humanity are offences against the entire world, not merely against specific nations. 12 defendants were sentenced to death, others received prison terms, some were acquitted. The trials were meticulously documented, creating a historical record of Nazi crimes that could not be denied. In subsequent proceedings, hundreds of lesser figures were tried: concentration camp guards, bureaucrats who organized deportations, doctors who conducted medical experiments on prisoners. Justice was imperfect, certainly. Many perpetrators escaped or received lenient sentences. But the principle was established that mass atrocity would be met with prosecution, not merely condemnation. In Japan, similar proceedings occurred. The Tokyo trials prosecuted Japanese leaders for war crimes and crimes against peace. The rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, the brutal treatment of prisoners and occupied populations, all were documented and prosecuted. 7 defendants were executed, including General Tojo, who had led Japan during most of the war. But there was a notable exception. Emperor Hirohito was not prosecuted. General MacArthur, commanding the American occupation of Japan, decided that maintaining the emperor was essential for Japanese cooperation during occupation. Whether Hirohito bore responsibility for Japanese aggression was debatable, but excluding him from prosecution suggested that justice was tempered by political convenience. It was a reminder that even in defeat, power dynamics shaped outcomes. The occupation of Japan proved remarkably successful, largely due to MacArthur's administration. Japan was demilitarized, its armed forces disbanded, its weapons destroyed. A new constitution, largely written by American lawyers, established democracy, renounced war, and guaranteed civil rights. Land reform broke up the large estates that had dominated rural Japan. Labor unions were encouraged, women received the vote. Japan was being transformed from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy. The transformation faced obstacles. Many Japanese resented occupation, felt humiliated by their defeat, struggled with the destruction of their former way of life. But MacArthur managed the occupation with a mixture of firmness and respect for Japanese culture. The emperor remained as symbolic head of state, providing continuity. Japanese administrators handled most day-to-day governance under American supervision, and American aid poured in to rebuild infrastructure, restart industry, feed the population. In Germany, Occupation was more complex because of the four-power arrangement. The Soviets stripped their zone of industrial equipment, shipping entire factories to the Soviet Union as reparations. They imposed communism, suppressed opposition, and integrated their zone into the Soviet bloc. The Western powers initially planned to prevent German rearmament permanently, to keep Germany weak and divided. But as tensions with the Soviet Union increased, policy changed. The Marshall Plan, announced in June of 1947, represented a revolutionary approach to post-war reconstruction. Rather than extracting reparations from defeated enemies, America would provide massive economic aid to rebuild Europe. The reasoning was both humanitarian and strategic. A prosperous Europe would resist communist influence. Rebuilt European economies would become markets for American goods. Poverty and desperation had fueled extremism after the Great War. Prosperity might prevent its recurrence. 16 nations participated in the Marshall Plan. Over 4 years, America provided roughly $13 billion in aid, equivalent to well over $100 billion in modern currency. The aid rebuilt infrastructure, restarted industries, stabilized currencies, and financed trade. It was the most generous victor's peace in history, and it worked. European economies recovered, democracy took root in former dictatorships, and communism's appeal diminished in the West. The Marshall Plan was offered to Eastern European nations as well, but Stalin forbade their participation. He saw it as American imperialism, an attempt to extend capitalist influence into Soviet sphere of influence. His refusal deepened the division of Europe. The nations that accepted Marshall aid prospered. Those under Soviet control stagnated. The contrast would become increasingly stark over the following decades. Consider the difference between the peace after the First World War and the peace after the Second. After 1918, the victors punished Germany with reparations, territorial losses, and military restrictions. The result was resentment that fueled Nazi rise to power. After 1945, the Western Allies rebuilt their former enemies, integrated them into a democratic international order, and provided aid to ensure prosperity. The result was that Germany and Japan became peaceful, democratic, and prosperous nations. The lesson was clear. Peace built on punishment is fragile. Peace built on reconstruction and integration is stable. It costs more initially, but prevents future conflicts. The Marshall Plan's investment was repaid many times over through the prosperity and stability it created, yet not all peace efforts succeeded. In Eastern Europe, Soviet occupation brought communist regimes that ruled through force and suppressed dissent. Elections were held but rigged. Opposition parties were banned or intimidated. Secret police arrested those who resisted. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill in 1941, had promised self-determination for liberated peoples. In Eastern Europe, that promise was broken. The nations freed from Nazi occupation found themselves under Soviet control. The United Nations, established in October of 1945, represented hope that international organization could prevent future wars. The League of Nations, created after the Great War, had failed to stop aggression in the 1930s. The United Nations was meant to succeed where the League had failed. It had a Security Council with 5 permanent members, each possessing veto power: America, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. This structure reflected post-war power realities. The UN provided a forum for international diplomacy, a place where nations could talk rather than fight. It established international law, created mechanisms for peacekeeping, and addressed humanitarian issues. But the veto power of permanent Security Council members meant that the UN could not act when great powers disagreed. During the Cold War, the Security Council was often paralyzed by Soviet and American vetoes. The UN became a debating society rather than an effective enforcer of international order. Still, the UN's existence mattered. It provided legitimacy to international action when consensus could be reached. It established norms and principles that, while often violated, created standards by which nations could be judged. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, defined aspirations that influenced liberation movements worldwide. The UN was imperfect, but it was better than nothing. The atomic bomb cast its shadow over all post-war planning. America had a monopoly on nuclear weapons initially, though that would not last. In August of 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. The nuclear age had begun, and with it came new strategic calculations. Nuclear weapons made total war between great powers, potentially suicidal. If both sides possessed atomic bombs, their use would trigger mutual destruction. This led to the doctrine of deterrence. Maintain sufficient nuclear forces to ensure that any attack would be met with devastating retaliation. No one could win a nuclear war, so the goal became preventing one from starting. It was a terrifying stability, peace maintained by the threat of annihilation. The Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949 tested the post-war order. The Western powers had introduced a new currency in their German zones, strengthening their economy but threatening Soviet economic control of the East. Stalin responded by cutting off all land access to West Berlin, attempting to starve the Western sectors into submission or abandonment. The Western response was the Berlin Airlift, supply the city entirely by air. For nearly a year, American and British aircraft flew supplies into West Berlin. At the operation's peak, a plane landed every 3 minutes, delivering food, coal, medicine, everything a city needed to survive. It was a logistical triumph and a political statement. The West would not abandon Berlin. Stalin eventually lifted the blockade, having failed to expel Western presence. Berlin became a symbol of the Cold War, a divided city in a divided nation in a divided Europe. The question of war criminals beyond the major trials remained contentious. Thousands of Nazi functionaries, concentration camp guards, and collaborators had participated in atrocities. Some were prosecuted. Many were not. Some escaped to South America or the Middle East, living out their lives in exile. Some returned to ordinary life in Germany, their pasts hidden or ignored. The pursuit of justice was incomplete, compromised by practical difficulties and Cold War priorities. West Germany needed to rebuild quickly to serve as bulwark against Soviet expansion. Prosecuting every person who had been involved with the Nazi regime would have been impossible and would have alienated much of the population. A choice was made, consciously or unconsciously, to focus on major perpetrators while allowing lesser figures to reintegrate into society. It was pragmatic but morally troubling. Justice was subordinated to political necessity. In Asia, decolonization accelerated after the war. European empires, weakened by conflict, could no longer maintain control over colonies that had been promised eventual independence as reward for wartime support. India gained independence from Britain in 1947, Indonesia from the Netherlands in 1949, the Philippines from America in 1946. French and British colonies in Africa would gain independence in the following decades. This decolonization was often violent. Colonial powers were reluctant to relinquish control. Independence movements, strengthened by wartime resistance experience, were determined to be free. In Indochina, the French tried to maintain control, leading to war that would eventually involve America. In Algeria, the French fought a brutal conflict against independence movements. The empires that had ruled much of the world were dissolving, and the process was painful. The peace after the Second World War was thus multiple pieces: the successful transformation of Germany and Japan from enemies to allies, the imposition of communist control in Eastern Europe, The division of Europe into competing blocs, the creation of international organizations to prevent future conflict, and the acceleration of decolonization. Some of these developments fulfilled hopes for a better post-war world. Others represented the emergence of new tensions that would define the second half of the 20th century. Consider what had been achieved despite enormous challenges. Two nations that had waged aggressive war were transformed into peaceful democracies. War criminals were prosecuted, establishing precedents for international justice. Economic aid rebuilt shattered economies. International organizations were created to address global problems. These accomplishments, while incomplete and imperfect, represented genuine progress toward a more stable international order. Yet the failure to achieve cooperation between former allies poisoned much of this progress. The division of Europe, the nuclear arms race, the ideological conflict between capitalism and communism, these created new dangers that would persist for decades. The peace was not the peace that had been hoped for during the war, when Roosevelt dreamed of great powers cooperating to maintain global stability. The fundamental problem was that defeating a common enemy did not create common vision for what should follow. The wartime alliance had united nations with incompatible ideologies and opposing interests. When the binding force of fighting fascism was removed, the differences emerged with full force. The Soviet Union wanted security through control of neighboring states. The Western powers wanted democracy and open markets. These visions could not be reconciled. And so the world that emerged from the Second World War was divided but not destroyed. Peaceful in the sense that another world war did not immediately occur, but not peaceful in the sense of true harmony between nations. It was a world where nuclear weapons made great power conflict too dangerous to contemplate, but where proxy wars, espionage, and ideological competition continued. It was a world where international law existed but was enforced selectively. It was a world where the memory of recent catastrophe made leaders cautious, but did not eliminate conflict entirely. Managing victory proved as complex as winning it. The choices made in the immediate post-war years about how to treat defeated enemies, how to allocate aid, how to structure international organizations, shaped the world we still inhabit. Some of those choices were wise, rebuilding rather than punishing, prosecuting major criminals, creating forums for international cooperation. Some were compromises born of necessity, accepting Soviet control of Eastern Europe because dislodging it would require another war. Some were failures, allowing many perpetrators of atrocities to escape justice, dividing nations and continents in ways that would cause suffering for generations. The peace after the Second World War was the best that could be achieved given the circumstances. It was not ideal. It did not fulfill all hopes or prevent all future conflicts. But it was better than the vengeful peace after the First World War, better than allowing fascism to survive, better than the alternatives that were available. From the ashes of the most destructive war in human history emerged an international order that, for all its flaws, prevented another global catastrophe and created space for prosperity and freedom to flourish in much of the world. The generation that won the peace deserves recognition alongside those who won the war. Their work was less dramatic but no less important. They rebuilt cities, wrote constitutions, prosecuted criminals, distributed aid, negotiated treaties, and created institutions. They made mistakes, certainly, but they also demonstrated that it is possible to learn from history, to build better peace from catastrophic war, to choose reconstruction over revenge. The world they created was imperfect, but it endured, and from its foundations, future generations would build further progress toward a more just and peaceful international order. Wars end, but their lessons persist. They shape how nations think about security, how generals plan campaigns, how politicians make decisions about when to fight and when to negotiate. The Second World War, the most devastating conflict in human history, left strategic lessons that would influence military thinking for generations. Some of those lessons were learned well, others were misunderstood or misapplied, and the consequences of both wise learning and foolish misapplication would shape conflicts for decades to come. Consider the immediate aftermath. Military planners across the world studied what had just occurred, trying to understand why some strategies succeeded while others failed catastrophically. The lessons seemed clear enough. Combined arms operations coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support proved devastatingly effective. Strategic bombing could cripple enemy industry and morale. Aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the dominant naval weapon. Intelligence and code breaking could provide decisive advantages. Industrial capacity determined who could sustain prolonged conflict. But there was a problem with these lessons. They were true for the war that had just been fought. Whether they would remain true in future conflicts was less certain. Generals, it is often said, prepare to fight the last war. And in the decades following 1945, this tendency would lead to both successes and catastrophic failures. The United States emerged from the war as a global superpower, the only major nation whose territory had not been devastated by combat. American industrial capacity dwarfed all competitors. American military technology, particularly in nuclear weapons and long-range aircraft, gave it capabilities no other nation possessed. This unprecedented power brought unprecedented responsibility, and American leaders had to decide how that power would be used. The first test came quickly. In June of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The Korean War, often called the Forgotten War, represented the first military conflict of the Cold War era. It also represented the first attempt to apply World War II lessons to a new type of conflict. General MacArthur, commanding UN forces, initially planned for a quick victory through amphibious landing at Incheon, a maneuver reminiscent of Pacific island hopping campaigns. The landing succeeded brilliantly, cutting North Korean supply lines and routing their army. But then China intervened, sending hundreds of thousands of troops across the Yalu River. MacArthur, confident from his World War II experience, had not believed China would risk war with America. He had misread both Chinese determination and the changed strategic environment. Nuclear weapons, which America possessed and China did not, constrained American options. Using nuclear weapons against Chinese forces would risk Soviet intervention and potential nuclear war. The conflict that MacArthur thought would be a straightforward military victory became a grinding stalemate. Korea taught a crucial lesson that contradicted World War II experience. In the nuclear age, total victory might not be possible. Limited wars, fought for limited objectives, might become the norm. The goal was not to destroy the enemy completely, but to achieve specific political objectives while avoiding escalation to nuclear conflict. MacArthur never accepted this lesson. President Truman relieved him of command, recognizing that the general's World War II mindset was unsuited to Cold War realities. The Korean War ended in stalemate, roughly where it had begun. To those who remembered the unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan, this outcome seemed like failure, but it represented a new strategic reality. In a nuclear world, limited conflicts might end in compromise rather than total victory. This was not the lesson World War II had taught, yet it was the lesson the nuclear age demanded. Vietnam would demonstrate how catastrophically World War II lessons could be misapplied. American planners, remembering how strategic bombing and industrial warfare had defeated Germany and Japan, believed similar approaches would work in Southeast Asia. They bombed North Vietnam, destroyed its limited industry, interdicted supply routes, and applied overwhelming firepower. None of it worked as expected. Vietnam was not an industrial power whose factories could be destroyed. It was a largely agricultural society, waging guerrilla war in jungle terrain. The North Vietnamese did not need to win battles in conventional sense. They needed merely to survive, to continue fighting, to make the war more costly than America was willing to sustain. World War II had been total war between industrial nations. Vietnam was limited war against an enemy that could absorb punishment and continue fighting. American generals, trained in World War II methods, struggled to adapt. They measured success in body counts, assuming that inflicting casualties would break enemy will, as it had in previous conflicts. They did not understand that for North Vietnam, casualties were acceptable cost. The war was about national unification and resistance to foreign intervention, and people will endure extraordinary suffering for such causes. Moreover, the American public's tolerance for prolonged war was limited in ways it had not been during World War II. That earlier conflict had clear moral stakes: defeating fascism, responding to direct attack, preventing totalitarian domination. Vietnam's stakes were less clear. Why were American soldiers dying in a civil war in a small Southeast Asian nation? The domino theory, the idea that communist victory in Vietnam would lead to communist expansion throughout Asia, seemed less compelling as the war dragged on without victory. The lesson of Vietnam, learned painfully, was that overwhelming military power does not guarantee success if the conflict's political dimension is misunderstood. World War II had been fundamentally about military defeat of enemy forces. Vietnam was fundamentally about political will, and no amount of bombing could create political support for a regime in South Vietnam that its own people often opposed. The generals who had learned World War II lessons, found those lessons inadequate for a new type of conflict. Yet some World War II lessons did prove enduring. The importance of alliances, demonstrated by the grand coalition that defeated the Axis powers, shaped post-war American strategy. NATO, established in 1949, represented institutionalized alliance designed to deter Soviet expansion. It worked. For over 40 years, NATO maintained peace in Europe, preventing the Soviet Union from attempting the westward expansion many feared. The Marshall Plan's success in rebuilding former enemies as democratic allies became a model for future interventions. After conflicts in the Balkans in the 1990s, international aid focused on reconstruction and integration into European structures. After the Cold War ended, former Soviet bloc nations were welcomed into European economic and security organizations. The lesson that generosity toward defeated enemies creates stable peace had been learned and applied successfully. Nuclear deterrence, the most profound strategic innovation of the post-war era, rested partly on World War II lessons. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated nuclear weapons' destructive power in ways that no theoretical calculation could match. Leaders who might otherwise have been tempted to use nuclear weapons in Korea or Vietnam, or during the Cuban Missile Crisis, had seen the photographs from Japan, understood the reality of what those weapons did. That understanding, born from the only times nuclear weapons were used in war, helped prevent their use thereafter. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, often abbreviated as MAD, relied on this understanding. If both superpowers possessed nuclear weapons in sufficient quantity, neither could attack without facing its own annihilation. It was a terrifying logic. Peace maintained by the threat of extinction, but it worked. The Cold War remained cold precisely because leaders understood that hot war between nuclear powers would be suicidal. The European integration, the process by which former enemies became partners in common institutions, represented another enduring lesson from World War II. The war had demonstrated the catastrophic cost of European conflict. French and German leaders, remembering the devastation, decided that economic integration would make future war impossible. If French and German economies were intertwined, if coal and steel production was managed cooperatively, war between them would be unthinkable. The European Coal and Steel Community, established in 1951, became the foundation for what would eventually become the European Union. It represented the application of a crucial lesson. Nations bound together by common institutions and shared prosperity are less likely to fight each other. The continent that had been the epicenter of 2 world wars became a zone of peaceful cooperation. It was one of the most successful applications of lessons learned from World War II. Decolonization, accelerated by the war, represented the collapse of assumptions about racial hierarchy and imperial control. Colonial powers had promised their subjects eventual self-government in exchange for wartime support. Those subjects, having seen their colonial masters defeated by Japan or weakened by war, no longer accepted subservient status. The Atlantic Charter had promised self-determination. Colonial peoples demanded that promise be kept. Britain, recognizing it could no longer maintain its empire, generally withdrew with relatively little violence. India's independence in 1947 was accompanied by terrible partition violence, but the transfer of power itself was negotiated. France and Portugal resisted longer, fighting brutal wars to maintain colonies. They lost. The lesson, learned slowly and painfully by some colonial powers, was that empire in the old sense was no longer sustainable. The world had changed, and attempts to preserve pre-war imperial structures were doomed. The lesson about the importance of military readiness was learned perhaps too well. The war had been won partly because America's industrial mobilization transformed peacetime economy into wartime production within years. But maintaining such readiness permanently was expensive and potentially dangerous. President Eisenhower, in his farewell address in 1961, warned of the military-industrial complex, the permanent alliance between defense contractors and military establishment that benefited from continued high military spending. The concern was valid. Permanent mobilization, constant military spending, the maintenance of enormous military establishments, even in peacetime, these were historically unusual. They were responses to the nuclear age and Cold War competition, but they also created interests that benefited from tension, that resisted arms control agreements, that saw military solutions to problems that might be better addressed through diplomacy or economic means. Intelligence capabilities, so crucial to Allied victory, became permanent features of the post-war order. The CIA, established in 1947, grew from wartime intelligence services like the OSS. Soviet intelligence agencies, already extensive, expanded further. Both superpowers conducted espionage, covert operations, and information gathering on unprecedented scales. The intelligence war that had helped win World War II became a permanent feature of Cold War competition. But intelligence capabilities brought temptations. The CIA and Soviet counterparts engaged in coups, assassinations, and interventions that had little to do with gathering information and much to do with shaping political outcomes. The lesson that intelligence was valuable became an excuse for activities that were often counterproductive. The overthrow of democratically elected governments, the support for dictators who aligned with superpower interests, these actions undermined the democratic values World War II had supposedly been fought to defend. The strategic bombing campaigns against Germany and Japan left ambiguous lessons. They had certainly contributed to victory, destroying industrial capacity and disrupting production. But post-war analysis suggested they had been less effective than believed during the war. German production continued despite bombing, even increased in some categories. Japanese willingness to fight was not broken by firebombing of cities. The decisive factors had been ground force advances, and in Japan's case, the atomic bombs combined with Soviet entry into the war. Yet air forces in the post-war period continued to emphasize strategic bombing. The belief that air power alone could win wars persisted despite Vietnam's demonstration that bombing a non-industrial society achieved little. It was not until precision-guided munitions and advanced intelligence capabilities emerged in the 1980s and 90s that strategic bombing became as effective as its advocates had long claimed. The lesson had been learned from World War II. but the technology to properly apply that lesson took decades to develop. The Holocaust left perhaps the most profound lesson: that civilized societies could descend into barbarism, that systematic genocide was possible in modern industrialized nations, and that never again required constant vigilance. The Genocide Convention, adopted by the UN in 1948, established that genocide was a crime under international law. The principle that sovereignty did not protect nations that committed mass atrocities became accepted, if not always enforced. Yet, genocides continued. Cambodia in the 1970s, Rwanda in the 1990s, Bosnia in the 1990s. The international community's response was often slow and inadequate. The lesson that genocide must be prevented was learned intellectually, but not always applied practically. Political will to intervene in other nations' affairs, especially when no direct national interest was at stake, remained limited. The gap between principle and practice persisted. The economic lessons of World War II shaped post-war international economic institutions. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 established the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, institutions designed to prevent the economic nationalism and competitive devaluations that had worsened the Great Depression. The lesson was that economic cooperation served everyone's interests, that protectionism harmed all nations, that international institutions could manage economic relationships more effectively than purely national policies. These institutions, for all their flaws, contributed to unprecedented global prosperity in the decades following the war. International trade expanded dramatically. Economic growth lifted millions from poverty. The lesson that economic integration promoted peace and prosperity was validated by results. The European Union, NAFTA, and other trade agreements rested on this foundation, though the benefits of trade were unevenly distributed, creating political backlash in later decades. Perhaps the most important lesson, and the most frequently forgotten, is that wars are easier to start than to end, easier to win militarily than to resolve politically. The Second World War was won decisively on the battlefield, but the peace that followed was complex and imperfect. The division of Europe, the Korean stalemate, the Vietnam disaster, these represented the difficulty of translating military victory into lasting political solutions. Leaders who learned World War II's military lessons sometimes forgot its political lessons. They remembered how to win battles but forgot that winning battles does not automatically create stable peace. They remembered the importance of firepower and industrial capacity, but forgot that political legitimacy and popular support ultimately determine outcomes. They remembered that democracies could mobilize for war but forgot that democratic publics require clear justification for sustained conflict. The generation that fought World War II gradually passed away, and with them went first-hand understanding of what that conflict meant. Their children, the baby boomers, learned about the war from books and films rather than experience. Their grandchildren knew it only as distant history. Each generation further removed from the war risked forgetting its lessons or learning wrong lessons from selective memory. The war became myth as much as history, a story of good versus evil, of clear moral stakes and unambiguous victory. This myth contained truth but obscured complexity. It made future leaders overconfident that military power could solve political problems, that clear enemies and decisive victories were always possible, that the moral clarity of World War II could be replicated in more ambiguous conflicts. Yet for all the lessons mislearned and misapplied, World War II did teach enduring truths: that democracies can unite against existential threats, that economic strength ultimately determines military capacity, that intelligence and deception can multiply the effectiveness of force, that alliances matter, that generosity toward defeated enemies creates stable peace, that nuclear weapons changed warfare fundamentally, that genocide must be prevented and punished, that international institutions, imperfect though they are, serve necessary functions. The world we inhabit today was shaped by that conflict and by the lessons drawn from it. The absence of great power war for over 80 years, the longest such peace in modern history, owes much to lessons learned from World War II about the costs of conflict and the benefits of cooperation. The prosperity of former enemies, Germany and Japan, now among the world's most peaceful and prosperous nations, demonstrates that reconstruction works better than punishment. But the persistence of conflict, the continued use of the military force for political ends, the gap between international law's principles and its enforcement, these remind us that lessons are never learned permanently. Each generation must relearn what their predecessors understood, must apply old lessons to new circumstances, must resist the temptation to believe that past patterns will repeat exactly. The Second World War was the last great conflict fought in partial ignorance of its lessons. Every war since has been fought by leaders who knew what happened between 1939 and 1945, who studied those campaigns in military academies, who claimed to have learned from that conflict's successes and failures. Yet they continued to make mistakes, continued to misapply lessons, continued to discover that the past, however carefully studied, never repeats precisely. Perhaps the ultimate lesson is humility, understanding that history teaches, but never perfectly. That strategic wisdom requires adapting old knowledge to new circumstances, that the price of mislearning can be measured in lives and suffering. The generation that fought World War II earned the right to teach those lessons through their sacrifice. Whether subsequent generations have been worthy students remains an open question, one answered not by words but by actions, not by claims to have learned but by wisdom demonstrated through choices made in moments of crisis. The strategic legacies of World War II persist in the institutions we maintain, the alliances we honor, the doctrines we follow, and the mistakes we sometimes repeat. They shape our world still, 8 decades after the guns fell silent, and they will continue to shape it for as long as humans remember that the greatest war in history taught lessons too important to forget, too complex to reduce to slogans, too vital to ignore. What we choose to remember, how we choose to apply those memories, will determine whether the catastrophe of World War II serves as warning, preventing future disasters, or merely as prologue to tragedies yet to come.